Hey
Hey everyone, welcome to the Bread of Life channel. I'm here with MJ. He has a YouTube channel called Democracy of the Dead. And so please do go and subscribe to his channel. Link is in the description. And MJ is a Christian philosopher. He comes highly recommended. Most of you know Danny, our channel favorite atheist philosopher. And Danny says MJ is the best. So I tried to get the best for you today to answer a pretty hard question that a lot of people have presented to me. So, kind of the question is, why couldn't God create a world that has free will but no suffering? So, MJ, do you feel like you're ready to tackle that?
Nope, not at all. Well, it's nice coming on. Have a good day. Bye.
Okay.
So let me admit my humility up front. So I came into this world about 1983-ish, thousands of years of meditating on this issue. So I'm gonna do the best I can with this and know that I've had a pretty okay life. I've gone through a little bit of suffering, but I am aware as I talk philosophically of the horrible things that have happened lately and throughout history. I know that they're there, and sometimes the philosophy stuff is going to ring hollow if you look at it from that dimension or that perspective. I'm aware of all of that stuff, and I sometimes listen to myself, and I'm like, yeah, would I say this to somebody grieving the loss of a loved one, or somebody who had just gotten done going through something that you would read from the Brothers Karamazov? I don't know if you've ever read this book, but it's got some things from Ivan Karamazov that are pretty breathtakingly horrible. And I think he even says something like, even if one child gets harmed, then God's go-ahead decision to create is automatically not justified, or something like that. And I mean, how do you argue with that? It's really hard to argue with that. So you got to kind of tease out the logical points he's kind of making and kind of quarantine temporarily the emotion that's wound up in some of the instances of evil that you would have to discuss. But I was going to ask too, the category of suffering is really broad to me, because I think suffering is sometimes even morally neutral. So I was just going to, I know that sometimes it's framed in terms of suffering, but sometimes it's framed in terms of pain. Sometimes it's framed in terms of evil. And I wonder how the Venn diagram would look if we kind of related those three categories. Because suffering, like, I like to go to the gym. My body's falling apart though, so I don't enjoy it the way I used to. But when I'm sore, that's kind of suffering, but it's kind of a cool, pleasurable kind of suffering. So it's kind of weird how these categories will relate to each other. So I wonder if we could like pin down exactly what we mean by suffering, and then maybe use that as our point of departure to kind of explore some options. I don't know.
Well,
Is that too weird?
okay. No, that's not too weird. So actually the thing that I was going to kind of use to guide our conversation is a conversation that I had with someone on the video I put out about animal suffering. So, there's, a YouTube atheist, cosmic skeptic. He put out a video about the biggest problem with Christianity is animal suffering. And I made a response video to that, giving my answer for animal suffering. And on the comments on that video, I ended up having a very long conversation with a really wonderful person named Chad. And so Chad and I talked about this over a 2-month period. And yeah, I loved our conversation so much. In fact, it's like I've had a lot of long conversations in the comment sections on my videos, but this was probably one of my favorite, definitely the most memorable. So I asked Chad permission to kind of use this, some of the comments that he made. And of course, there's a lot more, but I just kind of picked out some of the ways that he expressed this. So what if we did it like with animal suffering as the example? Is that
Now I'm going to be groping with you.
okay?
Because I've actually not read too much into animal suffering, but
Okay.
I don't think it would be completely worthless for us to just kind of like talk about it. Because I think
Okay.
my experience with talking about animal suffering is the wall I bump into is a methodological wall. I think we all, when we go into different research projects, whether those be for school or for things that we're personally trying to deal with, we come into these projects with certain amount of background beliefs about what we think is or isn't probable, or what we think might or might not be true. And we go in and we do the reading, and we cross-check that reading to what our initial beliefs were prior to the research project. So the kind of methodological disposition that I would have as I would go into the research project of animal suffering would be one that a lot of people would find absolutely ridiculous. So that would be, because the only reading I've done on this is a cursory reading of a guy named Michael Murray, I think is his name, and then the chapter from The Problem of Pain on animal pain. I think that's really about it. And then I've meditated on it. So I don't really have a lot of exposure to it. I haven't even heard cosmic skeptics' arguments about it. What I would hope that the solution that I lean towards is true, because it would just mean that the data that we have to go off of is basically just behavior. So they're writhing in agony, quote unquote. But what's going on in their consciousness as this is happening? And if God can kind of quarantine, or kind of make a consciousness sort of distinction between the bodily behavior and the conscious experience, I would see that as a good thing, because it's quarantining the animal consciousness from the actual bodily harm and the nervous system and all this stuff. I would think that's good. That would be the kind of background of belief I would have going into that research project. And if that gets falsified, I'd have to look at that problem from a different perspective than if it were, I don't know. What have you?
Okay, then let's scratch that. What have I done? Nothing. Okay, look, I answered from the Bible. I gave a Bible really answer. I am not a philosopher, so I gave a Bible answer.
We're all philosophers.
But so, okay, let's just scratch the animal part of it. How about let's just make it pain? Does pain work?
Pain is good. So yeah, C.S. Lewis wrote the book Problem of Pain.
Okay.
Again, though, it would be like morally relevant pain that's brought upon by evil. There's, like, I saw a comment, like, if you voluntarily choose to undergo this certain pain, is it still morally good or bad? Or are there morally neutral types of pain? So let's narrow it down to, I guess, the kind of pain I think we're all thinking of, like abuse or I don't know, like textbook examples of just like, that's
rape,
pretty evil.
Torture.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Stuff like that. So, and then we have to relate pain to salvific issues, like what's the reason behind the pain? Why would a good God permit the pain? Could an all-powerful God who was all good get rid of the pain and still have the amount of good that you want if the pain were eradicated? Can you tinker with certain things that happen in history and still get the results that you want, other things being equal? So there's a bunch of different ways I could get at this. I think maybe the first thing people think of when they think about this is in terms of, and correct me if I'm wrong, is in terms of salvation, right? Like, what purpose does this serve in God's overall plan with salvation?
Well, or I think it's more like, okay, let's not even go with salvation, but it's just like, why couldn't God create a world where free will exists? So we're not going to use free will. We're not going to say bad things happen because of free will, because we're going to we're not going to say pain happens because of free will, because we're going to explore, why couldn't God just create a world that had free will and yet none of this pain that we're talking about? And so maybe I can set it up by reading one of Chad's comments that kind of like,
that'd be cool.
Okay. So I kind of said to Chad, well, it's not, God isn't intending for people to get hurt, but it's kind of like, God set up the law of gravity. That doesn't mean God wants people to jump off buildings, and, he wants gravity to work, but he doesn't want people to get harmed. But if they jump off a building, they're still going to get harmed. And so Chad's response was this: Just as a thought experiment, imagine that it was possible for God to have created the world similar to this world, except that the natural result of someone jumping off a building is a harmless land on the ground rather than a harmful land on the ground. If such a world were possible, and if God is all-knowing, then God would have known that it is possible. Thus, by choosing to create the world where the natural consequence of falling off a building is death rather than non-death, God is effectively making a choice as to what the consequences of that action would be. If that's the case, then the same type of question that skeptics are asking regarding animal suffering could be asked regarding the fact that people die when falling off buildings. Why would an all-loving God who wants the best for people create the world in such a way that the people who jumped out of the Twin Towers on 9/11 were naturally crushed when they hit the ground? It seems to me that the best answer to this is to this kind of question is to posit that there would be some metaphysical impossibility entailed in the notion of creating the world in such a way that gravity is, say, strong enough to hold down cars, but not strong enough to kill people when they fall out of a skyscraper. And fair enough. While I think that's debatable, I'm more than willing to grant, for the sake of an argument, that such a world is impossible. But if that's the case, then all else being equal, death is a necessary consequence of falling out of a building. Can we reasonably say the same thing? Okay. Now we're getting into that. If I go further than that, it's going to be about the animal predation. But would you say there's a metaphysical impossibility for God to create a world in which, hey, gravity exists, but you still don't hurt yourself when you jump off a building?
I definitely think it's metaphysically possible. These are my intuitions. I do. I think it is, because I think when you talk about the relationship of gravity and falling bodies, I think it has to do with the laws of nature, which is a kind of narrower modality than, metaphysical. I'll just say metaphysical possibility. I think that God could tweak the laws of nature such that if you were to fall out of the building, the road would accommodate your body in the way a trampoline might, and then the second bounce would be like a pillow and a soft thing of feathers. I don't see any problem with thinking that kind of world is metaphysically possible. Yeah.
Okay, so it's metaphysically possible for that world.
Seems so.
So why didn't God do it that way? Why not create a world where we have the choice to jump off a building, but the consequence doesn't harm us?
So again, this is my speculation, because these are extremely difficult questions for me, but I do like exploring the options that we can lay on the table for us. This, I think, relates to what philosophers of religion and theologians call divine psychology. We're kind of trying to delve into what motives God has, or reasons God has, or what intentions God has to bring about a particular world that he has. One way to get at these motives is to generalize from our own experience, right? We have to start from our own experience, or we can go to the scriptures, right? Because we're gonna look at Christianity from the inside. Let's start from the outside first. It seems to me that one of the main, brief sidebar, this is going to depend on what your concept of God is. I think that all Christians share a certain core agreement on certain aspects of what God is, but they have disagreement about the semantic content of those properties, or maybe they will add other properties onto it. Maybe they'll say that because of those added on properties, an entailment of that is that we don't have certain, I'm going to ignore all that and stick with the core.
Okay.
I think that if God has as his overriding reason for creation, and Calvinists are going to get mad at this, but it's okay. They love me anyway. It's the maximization of salvation. So I don't think that the minimization of pain is going to necessarily overlap with the maximization of salvation. Now, this is going to relate to exactly what is it? How does God have access to what it is we would freely do under any particular set of circumstances? That's really what it comes down to. If we have this libertarian free will, and there's different kinds of libertarian free will. Calvinists are going to deny this. Calvinism is constantly in my mind. I'm always wrestling with it. I think it's a worthy opponent in my
Don't worry
mind.
about that. I'm not a Calvinist, and we
no, it's okay. I like actually bringing it out, but because I think a substantial percentage of Christians are Calvinists, so I like them to know that I have them in mind as I say this, along with open theists, and I love everybody. Okay, so if they're called. I want to stay away from philosophical jargon so bad, but sometimes it's unavoidable.
Go ahead. There's some people watching who will be into that.
Okay.
So don't worry about it. Just be natural.
I'm thinking of that. What was that guy's name again? That guy that you read?
Chad.
So it's when he brought up metaphysical impossibility. I do think metaphysical impossibility and metaphysical modality is involved. I do. I don't think it had to do with gravity, but I do think it has to do with the contingent truths, which happen to describe what we would freely do under any set of circumstances. If the propositions that go to describe that phenomena, whatever that phenomena is, us freely do whatever circumstances, if we are the ones that satisfy the truth conditions for those counterfactuals, God doesn't. We do. And so that is a metaphysical restriction on the kinds of worlds that God can bring about, that God's omnipotence can bring about. He can do everything that's metaphysically possible. He can do all that stuff, which is a lot of stuff. But one of the restrictions he's going to have, if he sovereignly chooses to actualize a world that involves libertarian free choices, is going to be a world where he's going to be stuck with a certain set of truths that are going to accurately describe how his creatures would act in the circumstances that God would sovereignly place them in. Before I go on, is that point clear? Because sometimes I lose people when I say that.
No.
So let's go. Clear. Not clear at all.
So wait, let me echo back what I think you're saying, and then you tell me what where I'm missing it. Okay.
Yes.
So, God, he knows, like, his highest concern. We're not talking about gravity. We're talking about salvation, and he's concerned with getting the max number of people saved. He knows all of our what we would do freely in any given situation. So he's allowing a world that, although it includes pain, it is still the best world possible for like basically the most people coming into his kingdom.
There might be a multiple number of worlds that are consistent with that constraint. There might be other worlds that are equally as good in terms of the number of people saved, but that might be different. So there might be other worlds God could bring about that would still meet that criteriological restriction. I totally admit that. So there's more than one. I have trouble with the logical coherence of there being a best possible world. That's why I mentioned that. But that sounded good to me. It sounds like we're on the same boat there.
Okay, good.
But what else though? Because this is actually key. This is the methodological bedrock that I would start from, and it would be defeasible. I would be willing to dialogue about any piece of that. I think we all start from a certain starting point. But
okay, so you're saying
Darwin's greatest hits is one of my friends. I like that guy.
Who is what? What?
I like Darwin's greatest hits. We talk all the time on Discord.
Oh, really?
James White disagrees.
So, okay, but you were going to go on from that point. You wanted to make sure I was following you at that point. So
yes, because if we are, I don't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry. No. If we aren't on the same boat there, I think we might be further and further off as we go on. Okay. But as long as you understand me, that'd be awesome. I don't
so is that...
I think I was doing that a lot last time.
No. And now, is that the complete answer, though? Like, we're on the same page with that, and boom, that's the answer. Or is there a way that you need to be pushed? Because I have more comments from
I always
chat.
need to be pushed. I always leave something out. So one thing I think I might be leaving out is an epistemic point. I think an epistemic point that needs emphasized is that because of the way I've outlined the model so far, like if that's the way it is prior to creation, and God, has these restrictions, these metaphysical restrictions on what world he brings about, if he sovereignly decides to bring about a world with libertarian free creatures, then what are we entitled to know for sure for us to have a good, solid objection against the goodness or power of God? What do we need to know about the world for that objection to get off the ground? And it seems to me, when I meditate on this issue, when I contemplate it, and I'm open to the possibility that I have a horrible imagination, but when I meditate on this issue and I look to any particular instance of evil, I look at any no matter how heinous. I mean, I've read some really awful, we don't even need to go into the details, but there's some really awful things that happen in this world. There are really awful things that have happened in this world. There are going to be really awful things that happen in the future, unspeakably awful things. But when I focus on one thing at a time, and I know it's a separate problem to look at the extent and the distribution of evil, these are separate issues we can come to later. But when I focus on one at a time, I have to say to myself, what reason do I have to come to the conclusion that God, who has the properties that we're agreeing that he has for stipulation here, wouldn't or couldn't or probably doesn't have a good reason to permit it? Now, a lot of people will conflate what I'm saying with a view called consequentialism. I don't think it's consequentialism, because from memory here, I have the internet at my fingertips, but I'd have to look it up. Consequentialism would say that the act that he's permitting, just by virtue of permitting it, and because it leads to those consequences, that particular act that led to the consequences is therefore good. I don't think that at all. I don't think any Molinist thinks that. Whatever God's permitting is evil. It's evil. And just because it leads to good consequences, whether it be salvific or not, doesn't make the thing permitted good or evil. It's evil when God's permitting it. So I think that move is more consistent with God's benevolence than to endorse some consequentialist ethic, which just says, because that thing led to good, therefore it was good. I don't believe that at all. So all that to say, when I look, I don't see, and this might be a problem with my mind, I don't have the confidence that I think I need, epistemically speaking, to say this evil is so heinous, it looks so inscrutable, it looks so gratuitous, it looks so awful, that I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, or even probably with the evidential versions of the argument, that this particular instance of evil could not lead to this overall picture I laid out at the beginning, the maximization of salvation, this intercausal connectivity of all our actions in the huge web of history, these things that go outside our experience, into the past, into the future. We have no idea. I don't know if you've seen these counterfactual type science fiction movies where you alter one thing in the past and all this stuff. Only omniscience would be able to orchestrate the astronomical detail involved in on the atomic level, on the macro level, on the free will decisions. And I have no idea. I mean, go to finite examples. I've heard this example from, I think, Paul Helm, where it's like you go to like a train track thing. I forget what it's called, but it's like all the little levers that make the train go to the left or the right. And you look at this thing and it's like this little labyrinth of all these little turnings and twistings where the train goes to the left and their trains are avoiding each other. And I have no idea how that works. How much more? I mean, there's an a fortiori argument kind of hidden in there to me. How much more?
Yeah.
How am I going to use these probability assessments to make an objection against God?
Yeah. Well, I think
that's just where I'm at.
Yeah, and I'm there with you too, and that's how I feel about it. But now, if you're starting with no belief in God, and you're looking at the world, and that's what a lot of people here are doing. So Cameron says this sounds post hoc, right?
Yes.
Kim says suffering exists because it needs to exist. You know, Cameron's like, it's the way it is because it's the way it is. So for those who are actually looking at the world and seeing the suffering, the pain, and saying, you know what, if there was this good and loving God, then I think he could have done it better. And so therefore I'm concluding that he's not there.
Yes. So I'm gonna deviate from the actual logic of the arguments real quick, because I think this is why that literature even exists in the first place. We all have different background beliefs. This is what I'm saying. Like, I don't know if you've read into the Bayesian kind of way people do probabilistic reasoning. It has to do with subjective probability. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but basically what it is this: you don't believe in God, so you're approaching the data. I bought this desk and it like cuts off my computer, so I can't get past this point. I mean,
Okay.
we approach the
No
data
problem.
from different like perspectives. So when, like, let's say we're sitting across from each other at the table, and you know, you have this card which has an instance of evil on it. We put it down on the table. Does that give you reason to doubt the goodness of God? Now, it depends. It depends on what background beliefs I have, because I'm going to be like, well, what reason do I have to think that this instance of evil should lower my credence levels relative to the background beliefs that I have? And then the guy across from me, all he can really say is, well, it ought to because of reasons X, Y, and Z, and then we're going to have a dialectic kind of spill out. But I totally understand from his epistemic perspective why my reasoning would be perceived as post hoc. I totally understand that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think to be wholly rational, he needs to do to me what I'm doing to him. He needs to see my epistemic perspective the same way I'm trying to sympathize with his, and just say, look, I mean, this might give you good reason to think that God probably doesn't exist, or the kind of God that has the properties that we're attributing to God probably doesn't exist. Totally understand that. If you want to talk about that, we can, and we got to go back and forth on the pros and cons of my background beliefs, which raise that probability. Because I think we might both agree that the prior probability might be either inscrutable or low. But I don't have his background beliefs, so I'm assessing that subjective probability completely differently. So that objection doesn't do much for me, especially with a thick concept of God that Christians have, and not just like a mere kind of omni God of perfect being theism. But
okay, well,
that's inevitable when anybody talks about any instance of anything, when they have different kinds of background beliefs. I don't know.
mm-hmm.
Am I off on that?
Well, yeah. I mean, no, you're not off on that. I mean, like I said, I'm with you in what I believe, but now we have to put ourselves in that place of that person. Correct. Because that is who we are trying to Correct. Reach. Correct. So, hi, Leo. I see Leo's making some good comments here. Let me see if this is an appropriate one for the point we're at. It seems that MJ is presupposing God's existence and is thereby arguing that if evil also exists, then God must have some justification for permitting it. Yeah, that's kind of what we've been doing so far, Leo. But now we're going to look at it from your perspective, which is not presupposing that God exists, and trying to, look at the world and say, MJ, why do you look at this world like, I mean, why couldn't, if there is this good and loving God, why couldn't he have done it differently to avoid? And let me just read one of Chad's next things, okay? Because, I went this direction with him, but his response was, what would the world look like? I asked him, what would the world look like if you were God? Okay. And he said, there's a good chance that if I were God, there wouldn't be any sin, because I would only create people who, like Jesus, would freely choose to do what's good all the time. So, here Chad is saying, look, okay, mm-hmm. I asked Chad, okay, well, if you were God, how would you do it better? Like, let's just assume, you're the good and loving creator. How would you do it better? And this is how he's saying he would make the world. Okay, there wouldn't be any sin, because he would only create people who, like Jesus, would freely choose to do what's good all the time. Note mm-hmm. that this wouldn't involve any violation of free will. Mm-hmm. But if for whatever reason I decided to create a world with sin, I would only allow certain types of sin, not including murder, rape, torture, kidnapping, molestation, etc. Mm-hmm. I see no reason why the freedom to perform those actions would add any value to creation. As for the consequences of sin, I would try to restrict those consequences such that they don't affect innocent people and animals more than necessary. For example, a child being born with horrible birth defects because of someone else's sin. That wouldn't happen if I were God. However, someone suffering a loss of reputation as a result of their lies being revealed, or a person suffering in prison due to theft, that could potentially happen if I were God. It's difficult to list everything I would or wouldn't change, but here's a short list of things that would definitely not be a consequence of sin if I were God. Animal predation, starvation, millions without clean drinking water, life-threatening diseases in children, physical deformities, mental retardation and learning disabilities, schizophrenia and other mental illnesses, pedophilic impulses, catastrophic earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, fires, etc. So why couldn't God just, if he really is good and loving, why can't he be as loving as Chad and make the world like that?
Yeah. So I do want to note a couple things. I was trying to pay attention to this. I did detect the inference from I see no good reason to therefore there probably is not a reason, or therefore there is no reason. Now that's just that's a controversial inference, because these are called no-see-em arguments in the literature. Basically, it just depends on what you think you should expect if you were to grant the truth of a particular thesis, and then based upon those expectations, you come to particular probability judgments about why it is you don't see what you're expecting to see. So I would dispute the no-see-em inference there. But the larger problem I have, and I wish he was here, because these are best talked about in conversation form, is I don't see, and no-see-em inferences with regard to finite creatures like myself can get off the ground a lot better. We're talking about God, so I'm off the hook a little bit. I don't see a good reason why.
Wait, what's the no-see-em? What's this no-see-em thing you keep mentioning?
No-see-em is this. Yeah, this comes from a version of the evidential problem of evil, which just says, okay, I don't see them. I don't see any good reasons for why this particular evil should be permitted. Therefore, probably whoever's permitting it isn't good, or whoever's permitting it doesn't exist.
Right. So it assumes that we have the ability we have all the knowledge, or that we have enough knowledge.
It assumes that you need to have more knowledge than you probably do to make the inference, but because you don't have the required knowledge to make the inference, then the inference can't be done, or something like that. You can't impugn the instance with the kind of probability you're attributing to it, because you don't have the requisite knowledge to say whether or not it's probable. And what they do is they extrapolate from certain examples from just everyday life, like I don't see any fleas in my room. There are probably no fleas in my room, right? So if I don't have like a background belief like already that could actually prop up that probability judgment, it's like, well, I don't have any animals in my house, so that makes that no-see-em inference probable. But if I had a dog and we've had flea problems in the past, and I just look at my room and say, well, I don't see any fleas, so probably there are no fleas. I'm not taking into account all the relevant information in my probability judgment. That's it gets kind of complicated, but I would say this is the main problem that I have, is if Chad, that's his name.
Just talk to. I'm Chad for now. Just make this I'm just make it like it's me. Okay,
and the way I argue is autobiographical sometimes. My bad.
And I'll do my best to be you, Chad, if you ever watch this.
How do you know? I would say, how do you know that you aren't stuck with? Because metaphysical restrictions are necessarily the case in the broad sense. How do you know that you're not stuck with the same metaphysical restrictions as we're saying God is? Because if God is stuck with the metaphysical restrictions that we said he was stuck with, it's epistemically possible. That means for all we know about our experience, about the world, about our modal speculations, for all we know, God is restricted by these truths that are contingently the case, because otherwise we wouldn't be free. But their contingent truth is a metaphysical restriction on the kinds of worlds God could bring about. So how do you know, Rebecca, that you aren't subject to those restrictions? Because we have the data that we have from the actual world. For example, we have the data that if I were in the particular circumstances that I'm in, and I have the history that I have up until this point in time, I would freely join you on this StreamYard call. If I were to describe that with a proposition, I could bracket that and just say that proposition is either true or false. Up until the time it happened, it was in the future tense mood. Then the time emerged during which it would happen, and then it changed the indicative mood. And the only reason why that indicative counterpart for that future tense proposition became true is because I freely satisfied the truth conditions for that proposition. And here we are. And therefore, it is true. It's a metaphysical restriction on your part with the kind of world you bring about in terms of what you would want me to do if you left me free in the circumstances in this particular world about whether or not I'd come on the StreamYard call. I freely came on. So now you can't actualize a world in which those circumstances stay the way they are. And I don't freely come on the StreamYard call. These are called backward-looking counterfactuals. You look back. So that right there is a metaphysical restriction. If you were to create a world with the past history that this world has and left me free this morning to come on you cannot actualize a world where I don't freely come on, even though it's possible in the narrow sense, right? We can imagine this proposition being true. But if you went to go actualize it, that world wouldn't come about. I would freely come on. Oh, what's up, Chad? That's perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I'm probably talking way past everybody.
This is amazing, Chad. This is great. Okay, so I'm gonna put the stream link in here for Chad. So this is the first time you've talked in 7 months? Well, no. Remember, I told you he actually wrote on my channel yesterday, which to me was amazing.
Yeah.
Some of y'all will think that's a coincidence. I think it's God, but I'm putting the stream link in here. This is for Chad only. Okay, guys, Chad is going to come in and I'm so glad he is because, I think he's studied philosophy and right now, MJ, I am lost. I have no idea what you're talking. So I can't be Chad at this point. So I'm so glad Chad is actually here. That's really awesome.
I hate losing you. It feels awful.
Really?
Oh yeah. Well, the name of the game with philosophy is successful communication. If I'm speaking to the wind, that is not good. I don't like that.
Yeah. So talking. Chad, you can join the stream anytime. There's the stream link for you. And looks like other people are excited about this. We need some Chad. Yes, you do, because I don't understand all these fancy words.
Stop me. Stop me.
So, and thanks for everybody who's here. This is a really good crowd today. Hi, John B.
How many are here?
There's a lot of people here. Thank you guys for being here. So, okay. Well, I think and actually until he gets here, I thought he brought up the really interesting point about Jesus, because Jesus, would you say Jesus had free will?
Mm-hmm.
And would you say that
you have to unpack what that means a little bit, but definitely.
Yeah. So Jesus freely chose to do good all the time. So, Chad was like, I'd just make the people like Jesus. Well,
this is the thing. So in the literature, okay, please stop me if I say anything weird. What these modal metaphysicians are talking about is, what reason do we have to think that a certain collection of counterfactuals, you follow me right there?
No, but thankfully, Chad is here. Hi, Chad.
What's going on, man?
Hey, guys. Hey.
I'm just losing everybody. I'm a horrible
communicator. Okay.
Yeah, this is amazing.
Yeah, it was great timing.
Oh, was that me? You broke up for me a little bit.
Yeah, your mic is a little.
Can you guys hear me all right?
Not really.
Okay.
I mean, we can hear you, but not that well. Can you try adjusting in any way?
I'm turning my Bluetooth.
Okay.
I'm surprised mine's working this well, honestly. When it snows, it always goes in and out. This is perfect.
Can you hear me better now?
Ooh.
Yes, much.
Okay, great.
Yep. Okay. So do you want to respond to what MJ was saying?
I kind of missed part of what he said. I caught the part where you were talking about the inference that I was making from I don't see. to a particular conclusion. And I think you have a fair point there to an extent, though it seems to me that we engage in that type of reasoning to a large extent, with just about everything we think about. When you talked earlier about the Bayesian way of thinking, and that's kind of how I tend to think is, well, when we have a particular observation of something, and I think, is this observation more likely on hypothesis A or hypothesis B? It's not clear to me how we can engage in that type of reasoning without engaging in the types of inferences that I was making there. But maybe I'm making a mistake, and I'm not sure that I'm, prepared to defend all of what I said against your objection here. But I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that.
No, what you're saying is plausible. I will start out like this. The Bayesian probability theory, I'm not an expert in it. If you go to the SCP entry article on this, I mean, there's so many different variations on this reasoning that it boggles the mind. The probability calculi can be so complicated. It's really hard to follow. There are certain versions that are actually not that bad. What I think is worth maybe kind of keeping in the background as we talk about these probability judgments, I think, is what goes into the probability judgment of what's the prior probability of a particular hypothesis given a certain set of evidence. Yeah. And my contention has always been, as I wrestled with different philosophers that utilize this kind of probabilistic reasoning, is always like, I always hear their reasons for why they're fixing the prior probability of the hypothesis the way they are. And I'm always like, well, yeah, that would make a lot of sense if I had the same background beliefs as you do. So then I zoom out and I go, so what reason do I have to have the background beliefs that I do? And then it's more probability judgments with more background beliefs. But at a certain point, I do hit a bedrock where I think that, I don't want to run into like a Zeno type thing where I have this like objection against motion and then I get up and move around. But like at some point we have to get up off the ground and make our probability judgments. That's why I think a lot of this stuff can't be fixed criteriologically prior to discussion. I think a lot of this stuff comes out on a case-by-case basis in a dialogical kind of context.
I'm curious. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Yeah. What would you think about potentially using induction as a means of kind of justifying the inference that I was making? And just flesh that out a bit more. I mean, my experience with love personally and the kind of actions that are produced by feelings of affection and love establishes in my mind a sort of prior probability for how you treat people when you have those feelings and when you conversely experience hate. I have a great deal of experience in my life of what types of actions and circumstances people can put other people in as a result of those feelings. And so when I look around at the world, it seems I could potentially use my background knowledge in that respect to sort of bolster my inference that I was making earlier. Does that make any sense? Or I'm not sure that
it makes perfect sense. Okay. Considering the background knowledge that you put on the table just now, there's nothing that seems to me to be irrational about the kind of probability judgments that you come to based upon that. I think the next step in these types of conversations is to be like, I like to look at it as like cards you put on the table and we're sitting across from each other. And you just showed me your cards that you had. And I'm like, oh, yeah, okay. Well, yeah, that makes perfect sense for you to make the kind of probability judgments you just made. And then I put down my cards and I say, well, look at it from my perspective real quick, just like I looked at it from yours. And now let's look at these cards on a case-by-case basis and subject these cards to independent scrutiny, and which may or may not involve induction. Induction is really another one of these tricky can of worms. Another things that it's like, I know it when I see it. If I'm asked to define it, it's just, oh my God, here we go. I know the general way to do it, where you go from the particular to the general and the different forms it might take. I know all that, but I'm just saying, as far as like justifying it, getting it off the ground, infinite regress worries about the priors and all this stuff. It just depends. And I think what happens a lot of times is that people get stuck on a meta level and just start talking about methodological issues instead of actually talking about the actual cards themselves. Yeah. But then there has to be a healthy kind of back and forth. Like we have to be aware of the tools we're using and the things we're talking about. that we're trying to use the tools to fix and all this stuff. So I guess I would say that is a really roundabout way of saying I agree with you on love, but I would want to conceptually unpack that concept a little bit and then see if there might be analogical worries as we apply it to God's love and the kind of ontological position he has that might be such a divide between creatures and creator that it might have to be analogically understood or analogically applied, given that particular kind of perspective. And like I was telling Rebecca earlier, these issues are so complicated. I like to look at these issues as research projects. So that would be the methodological constraint that I would have as I started that research project.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people misconstrue. I'm not saying you're doing this at all, but I've seen this online a lot, that they think that there is like a paragraph that they're going to read, and it's just going to completely settle an issue in the way that the eclipse happened with Einstein's special theory of relativity or something like that. There's some kind of just crucial experiment that's going to, yeah. I think a lot of these issues are diachronic. I think that's why a lot of these philosophical issues are perennial. They're always going to come up because each generation has to wrestle with them in their own way. And a lot of these issues that come up have to be thought about and contemplated about for decades. And a lot of people treat it like speed chess almost. And it's really hard to look at it like that. Because I could be way off in what I'm saying, honestly.
And
I need another person.
And, I'm glad we're all the mindset that, like, no matter what side of the issue you fall on, we can all be reasonable, even if we have different opinions on these subjects. There was something you said earlier that I kind of wanted to go back to, and you were talking about the way you think about this and how you have difficulty kind of justifying the assumption that God couldn't have a justification for allowing the kinds of things that he does. And I'm just wondering what you think of the fact, well, I'll tell you how I kind of think about this, where it seems to me that when people do, I think you referenced the trolley problem earlier, when people do allow things that are harmful, and when they do that with a moral justification, it seems to always come down to a limitation of their power. Like just to reference the trolley problem, it's only a dilemma because of the lack of ability of the person who has to make that decision of where do I turn the tracks. If the person had the ability that God does to save both people on the tracks and the people on the train, then the dilemma kind of dissolves. And I see this as kind of an a priori reason for, maybe not a definitive reason, but for thinking that any kind of moral justification God could have would be subverted by his power, unless there's some kind of, like, going back to the metaphysical impossibility point, it seems like there's got to be some kind of constraints on what God can do, and that whatever his moral justification is for allowing the things he does, it's ultimately going to be grounded in those constraints as to what he's capable of. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I do want to say that I think that there's a distinction I would make between the kind of restrictions involved in free will and then the kind of restrictions involved in, like, Superman abilities to fix trolley type problems or something like that. Now, another question that arises in my mind is, what types of concerns does God have with regard to these two domains, the alleviation of pain and what Rebecca and I were talking about with regard to the maximization of salvation? How do they interact? Do the types of restrictions that apply to one domain apply to the other? I don't think they do. I think that if there are these finite physical restrictions, like trolley type restrictions, that even if God does have the power, I don't see why he wouldn't have the power to be able to save everybody's lives on the track. But what's left in the dark for me, what's still opaque, if I meditate on this, is whether or not the 5 folks that get up off the track, whose lives are saved, they get to go back to their family and they get to experience all those types of good. And then the other guy on the other side, whoever he is, gets to go back to his profession as being a doctor and curing cancer, or whatever. These thought experiments can be jerry-rigged. They're pretty funny. What happens, though, as a result of God physically saving them? One data point I have is that omniscience knows what would happen had he saved all of them, right? He minimizes the pain in that situation. But what I can't extricate myself from is the consequences. So we can imagine, like in a sci-fi type manner, like we can speculate what might happen. Let's just say the doctor is just, let's just go to the doctor. The doctor is just really grateful as his life is saved. He goes back to his family. He's more loving. He raises his kids well. Perhaps he was a bad father prior to this traumatic event he just went through or something like that. And he ends up being a good, or it's possible, let's just say, that his life's saved. He goes back to his house. He gets this weird tick in his psychology, which just says, oh, I can beat death now. And he gets all overconfident and arrogant. He's got these little things going on in his psychology. And then it bleeds over in his treatment of his family. His son sees his error. Let's just play it. So only omniscience would be able to see this. And perhaps, and like I said with Rebecca, I'm not a consequentialist, so I wouldn't say that a permitted evil turns into a good if it has good consequences. I don't like that. Mm-hmm. So he permits this bad thing, which is death, because it leads to this other good that I think is an overriding good, which primarily motivates God in his go-ahead decision to create a world, which is salvation. Salvation seems like the greatest good. And I think the reason why this doesn't ring true with a lot of people is because the content of that concept is obscure to a lot of people. It sounds like a reunion with family. It sounds like, I don't know, there's no like the cliched things that you say, all the tears will be wiped from your eyes. And it sounds like you're taking the Brave New World Soma. And it sounds like a cheap kind of trick to tell people to look that way. Don't look at the Holocaust that happened in the 40s. Don't do that. Come here. It's going to be so good in here. And see, that's the struggle I had with it, which gets into deep psychological issues that need to be talked about at some point by philosophers with their concept of heaven. This concept of heaven, the content of that concept, needs to be talked about more. I know Randy Alcorn has a book on it. Lewis talked about this a lot. But I think this is the key concept that needs to be injected into this issue of the problem of evil. Because if heaven is that good, if it's such an overriding good, then I am not in an epistemic position to say whether or not the finite evils I see do or don't probably contribute to that overriding good. I think that's the overarching concern I have, where I'm kind of like you right now. I think people have like here's an overarching point. I think people have like a weird kind of reaction to like a Christian apologist saying this kind of stuff, because they're seeing me as a member of a collective, which is an oppressor kind of group. I'm not saying you're saying this. I'm saying I've experienced this myself, where it's just like, all you're doing is trying to save face for this horribly disgusting institution. And why are you representing this institution? Because you're representing this institution, you're just as evil as the oppressors that you're representing. And I'm just trying to say, I am a Christian. I'm not denying that, but I don't see it as, I don't frame it that way. And I feel like I'm the same as you. I'm just thinking about the stuff the best way I can. I'm speculating as best I can here.
So for you, if I understand correctly, for you, what you suspect is God's moral justification for allowing the types of things he does has a lot to do with salvation, and that there's some kind of connection between perhaps maximizing the number of people saved and allowing the kinds
for
of
all we know, right?
Does. Yeah, I definitely think there's that's opening a possible door to explain these, why God does allow the kind of suffering that he does. It's certainly a possibility. I guess I'm tempted to sort of lean towards parsimony at this point and think about, Occam's razor, and is this really the most parsimonious explanation for why, why we see the kind of suffering we do? And if it's not the most parsimonious explanation, that doesn't mean it's false, obviously.
No.
But it's kind of like, if I see somebody performing a heinous act, I could also come up with some conceivable scenario under which it would be justified.
Right.
But our inclination, I think, perhaps for good reason, is not to do that, and to kind of just take it at face value and think, well, this person, they could have a justification for what they're doing, but they probably don't, And it might be difficult for me to actually flesh out which theory involves more assumptions or bigger assumptions, because that gets very complicated very quickly. But that's where I'm tempted to go when I listen to you, what you were just saying here.
Yeah, I would apply that explanatory virtue of parsimony carefully. For me. This gets into interesting questions with explanationism. Simplicity fascinates me.
Me too.
Because there's different kinds. There's syntactic simplicity. There's ontological simplicity of ontological posits, of kinds of entities you want to postulate. Complications having to do with the entity postulated, number of properties, number of entailment relations between the properties that you're predicating of the God, and all this stuff. I am willing to bite the bullet and just say it is more complicated, but that the other explanatory virtues come into account to offset that. What's a good word? That deficiency or something like that. I do think it could win out. Your explanation could win out in terms of parsimony, but it could lose out in terms of the other virtues. But I would be open to hear other arguments, like meta-type arguments for why, and I've read this in a couple different places, but it's hard to find the time now that I have this barbarian son of mine. But there's a bunch of people, a couple people I've seen in Phil papers that have thought that this virtue is the best virtue, and if it outweighs the other virtues, then it's good to go. But there's a lot of debate about that, so I'd have to enter into that debate. This is the annoying thing about problems of philosophy and philosophy of religion, because they're tentacles that go out into all these different other problems of philosophy, which have their own tentacles that touch all these other concepts. So that's probably the way I'd explore it. But
it's what makes philosophy interesting. Oh, go ahead, Rebecca.
No, I just wanted to ask, which virtue are you talking about? You said this virtue. Which
simplicity?
Virtue? Oh, okay.
Simplicity. There's a bunch of different ones. There's the famous ones are explanatory scope and explanatory power. There's also weird subjective ones like plausibility, degree of ad hocness, what we would expect if the theory were true. They pick different versions of the certain Bayesian formulations of probability. They'll just say, now I've heard different philosophers say that deliberating about what the probability of the evidence for a hypothesis would be, given that the hypothesis is true, is completely worthless. I think that's not right. Some people just toss out that entire part of the Bayesian calculus. I'm like, no, that's a really good question, actually.
Yeah, I'm kind of. You mentioned degree of ad hocness, and I'm curious if you think that would also be an area in which the
it depends.
Because my intuition says that the theory you're proposing is more ad hoc.
Yeah, you would have to argue for your particular concept of God. So my concept of God, I think, as you're bringing up these objections, they're opening up content of that concept that was already latent within the concept that hadn't been rendered explicit yet. That's just what's going on. I'm not adding anything on as a result of your objection after the fact. It is post hoc in like a literal, boring, banal sense that it came after the fact, but it's not ad hoc because I'm saying it was already a part of the theory. It was latent, conversational civility didn't demand I say it right away or whatever. But if I was writing a treatise on the concept of God, I would have included that in a footnote or something. I don't know.
You're saying entailed in your concept of God is the explanation for why God allows the things he does. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
The content of the concept of God will involve the properties and the entailment relations between the properties, and the entailment relations between the properties and what I would expect the world to be like given those properties. I think all of that is entailed in the content of the concept. And I think where the conversation needs to go next, which is really where it gets really interesting to me, is arguments for and against why certain entailment relations need to be given up, or why certain properties are logically incoherent, or why the possibility of two or more properties we're attributing to God are logically impossible, or something like that. The literature that's written on the concept of God comes from. We could argue that William Lane Craig, I don't know if you know this guy.
Oh yeah.
His entire project since like the 80s has been fleshing out properties of God, omniscience, eternality. He's writing a systematic philosophical theology right now, going into every single one of these properties. And that's kind of Swinburne's project too, because what you settle upon to be the concept of who God is, what the content of that concept is, that's going to be like your major driving, most fundamental methodological kind of beginning point by which you assess all these other problems of philosophy of religion. And then you got the normative thesis. Ought you to appropriate this concept of God when you investigate these different problems?
Yeah.
Now, I don't mean to cut you off because I was about to actually.
No, I didn't have anything to say. Go ahead.
This is all, I say all this tentatively. I'm a weird, idiosyncratic kind of thinker, I think, because all this stuff makes me very nervous. If I'm going to be completely honest with you, analytic philosophy of religion is fascinating to me, and I love it. And I don't have a lot of good objections against what, quote unquote, my side has to say. I will say this, though. And Van Inwagen has actually said, have you read Van Inwagen?
I'm familiar with some of his stuff on free will, but I haven't
free will.
Materialism, but I don't know him in depth.
He's a really good metaphysician. I like him a lot, but he says things like,
he's very unorthodox, if I understand.
He's very unorthodox, but what he says rings true to me a lot of times. He's like, I'm a metaphysician. I don't explain anything. I describe. He talks about in this back and forth with this other guy, David Armstrong, I think is his name. I'm not a police detective. I'm not a scientist. I'm not supposed to. My role isn't to explain things. And I've always thought about that. I'm like, well, what about all the inference to the best explanation type reasoning I see in natural theology? It's like, what is going on here? Is that wrong? Yeah. And I read a really good book lately. It's called Short Introduction to Continental Philosophy by Simon Creechley, I think. I forget how to say his last name. But he's got a final chapter in that book, and it's like steering between obscurantism and scientism. Okay, and scientism is kind of like a hot button issue right now. But the way to steer between these two is a discipline called phenomenology. Why don't philosophers of religion talk about this very much? I'm just so. This was a huge movement in the early 20th century, and it spawned a bunch of different movements. And what I'm saying, I mention all this because I think the way this dialectic has kind of unfolded in the latter half of the 20th century and early part of the 21st century is that we've taken our cue from Plantinga. And, Daniel Howard Snyder has tried to resurrect the logical problem of evil. I disagree with what he has to say there. And then go to the evidential problems with Draper and Rowan, and everybody's having a good discussion about this. But like the problem of evil that fascinates me more is like the phenomenological one, the existential one, the one that we own in our consciousness as we perceive evils in our world. Because every single time, like, I see a certain representation of evil in a movie, or I feel it as communicated to me through a poem or a song or in music, that has so much more of an oomph to me than reading about the wire-drawn reasonings of philosophers in this logical world. And this comes from, I think William Hasker has written a little bit about this existential problem of evil. I think Marilyn Adams wrote some books on this. But it's almost like books need to be written which have to say, get out of the books, like almost like go and live life and experience life aesthetically almost, and look at it. This was a professor of mine actually at HBU. He's got a book called, I don't know if you can see that, The Poetics of Evil Toward an Aesthetic Theodicy. This guy, Philip Talon. This guy needs to read more, write more books, but this is kind of his approach in here. It's just like, I think we've stagnated. I look at these problems in philosophy as chess games, and I feel like everybody's pieces are at the front. We're in the middle game, and whoever moves next, we're going to start losing a lot of pieces.
Yeah.
But everybody who's already kind of on white side or black side is kind of where they are, and where the rubber really meets the road is in our phenomenological experience. That's kind of where, I don't mean to completely derail the conversation, but
oh no.
The reason why I say this is because I see what Van Inwagen's saying. I think, to me, and this goes to hiddenness of God type objections, I think everything we need to know about God, the gospel, is right before our eyes. And that all we have to do is redescribe it properly. And in order to experience what Heidegger would call aletheia, an uncovering of truth. And I think these type of inferences that the sciences do in terms of explanation kind of like separate us more from the real world. And I know that when the sciences do it, it has real world implications in terms of technology and all this stuff. I'm not saying that, but when natural theology does it, it might be good, it might be plausible. I like it. But when I'm going through suffering, it doesn't do squat for me. If I can be completely honest, I won't have an objection to impugn the character of God logically, but it won't keep me from writing like a problem of pain book. But it won't prohibit me from writing a grief observed type book.
Yeah.
I think that's the more potent type of pain and suffering I think we all have to go through. The only type of suffering we experience is the one we go through. We're kind of responsible for that. And if and as an instance of redescription, I can say we're not just responsible for it. I'll redescribe it in terms of this. I've read this somewhere, but you don't just experience the evil you do. You're entrusted with the evil you experience. Well, whoa, that's a redescription. And this is what the postmoderns, I think, got right. I disagree with their view of truth. Of course, I think there's such a thing as truth. But I think that the postmoderns are onto something when they're saying that you can get at different aspects of reality through redescription. Redescription, I think, is a key thing, and that's what phenomenology does. I won't shut up. I got to shut up and let other people
No, that was
talk.
all really interesting. I
It's just going on and on. Rebecca's like, I'm never having this guy on.
Yeah, I actually have to go
annoying.
soon, so I'll hand it back to Rebecca, but it was great talking with both of you. I've got some stuff I got to do, but yeah, I've never really thought much about the distinction between the problem of evil from a phenomenological perspective as opposed to more analytically, because I see those two things as being intertwined inextricably. It's, you can't separate them. I mean, like the problem of evil wouldn't even exist if it weren't for phenomenology. So, but that's, I would love to talk with both of you more about this. I wish I didn't have to go, but I'm gonna
definitely let's do it again. Let's do it again. Okay. Thanks for coming on, Chad.
Sorry for talking too much. My bad.
Okay. No, you didn't. Thanks. Okay. You too. Okay, so
you gotta moderate better, Rebecca. What are you doing?
No, actually, that's
Just
I
mute
was
me.
gonna ask it. You know what? I was actually gonna take you there because one of the things that I like that when I was having my conversation with Chad, one of the directions that I went is I asked him like, but why does suffering deserve to dominate over all the other aspects of reality? I wrote, I don't believe suffering is supreme among the aspects we should consider. The existence of humans, animals, plants, beauty, goodness, consciousness, and love must factor in equally and probably above suffering when we're considering God's existence. So like, I was kind of like, you know, that was the point that I was making, that like, if we only consider the aspect of suffering in reality, if that's all we consider, then we might easily come to a conclusion that God, if he exists, is not good and loving, or we might come to the conclusion that he doesn't exist. But it's like, I don't think suffering deserves that kind of place. I think we have to consider in all of the aspects of our reality. And so it's, you know, when I consider the other aspects, that I find God in those places, and then that helps me understand the suffering. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's been said a lot. There's a lot of good. How do we explain that? We have to do like sociological studies, honestly, and like look at exactly what the distribution of evil is. Kind of like what the Phil Papers survey did. It basically undercut people saying, well, most philosophers think this, most thinkers think this. Let's actually take a poll and see what they actually think, so they don't use this as a rhetorical device. That's kind of the way why the survey was done. And I think a lot of something similar happens with the problem of evil. We just say these sweeping claims, and we pinpoint, like what Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message, and you got Jean Baudrillard in his he's got this thing called hyper reality, or post the internet, especially, all we have is these images, these images that are mediated to us by the powers that be. And what happens with the framing of this issue is that we focus like a razor, you know, because we're talking about the problem of evil, on these atrocious, disgusting things that have happened throughout history that nobody's going to deny happened. But what if we did that equally so with every good thing that ever happened? And what happens to our probability judgments when we focus on those things? They'll say, well, you're not talking about the problem of evil anymore. Well, I think we are in an indirect way, because my concept of evil, at least if I could speak autobiographically, is always kind of related to what I think about what's good, because I'm always contrasting it, because I don't want it to be. I want it to go away. So I'm always like, okay, well, why is it evil? Because it ought not to be. And if it ought not to be, then you got this good state of affairs. I don't think you necessarily do that with good states of affairs. But yeah, I think that's true. I think that is a relevant part of talking about the problem of evil. And it needs to be studied sociologically with studies like Michael Jones style. This guy's like the king of studies. I don't know where he gets all these studies. And we need to get to the bottom of exactly.
Kim's laughing at me. Yeah, Kim's laughing at me.
This is a good example. So this is redescription. This is what I was talking about before. This is redescription. You can redescribe something to make it look bad, but then I'll just redescribe that redescription and put us back on focus. This is why I think phenomenology is like so important to me.
I don't know what that word means, but don't try to explain it to me. I've already taken classes and they've tried to explain it to me. I'm not going to.
And these Germans came together.
Okay, wait.
Trust me, you're doing it every day.
I'm doing it every day?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess, I don't know. Anyway, but let's just bring it back. How much longer do you have to talk? Do you need to go?
My wife gave me the green light.
Okay.
I am totally free.
So, I mean, why can't, like I said, we're just going back to why didn't God just create free will and no pain?
Right.
And we're all like Jesus, where, hey, we're the type of beings who would freely choose the good. And we would always freely choose the good. And, when you jump off a building, you don't get hurt. And one of the things that people bring up is, hey, do you think, these evil things can happen in heaven or in God's kingdom? And I say, no, I don't think there's any pain or, suffering in God's kingdom. So then they're saying, well, then why can't we just have that now?
Right. So I've read about this. Here's the reason.
Yeah.
Very, very quickly. I'm going to speak in thesis sentences from now on because I ramble. Heaven is not a possible world. It's an outcome of a possible world. So you can't actualize heaven without actualizing the antecedent conditions. Because if you study the content of the concept of heaven, what's going to happen is you're going to discover content that's inextricably linked to antecedent conditions. And these antecedent conditions are going to involve our lives here on this earth, making decisions here in this life to form character over time, all this stuff. And so any concept of heaven I've ever meditated upon, I've always found it unavoidable to link it to antecedent conditions of this prior life. So heaven is not a possible world in itself. He can't actualize this thing apart from the antecedent conditions. It's like trying to actualize a square with no corners or something like that. It's kind of conceptually analogous like that. So what they're thinking of, they're conceptualizing heaven as its own, like, let me use my imagination, as its own little bubble floating there. Oh, it's one of the green bubbles, so therefore it's actualizable. I'm just going to tap on it and boop, there it is. No, the content of the concept of that particular world is not an isolated bubble, but the outcome or a part of a whole possible world, which involves these antecedent conditions, which I think we have no good reason to think won't involve pain and suffering and damnation, unfortunately. But the key thing is the damned that God knows will be damned should not have veto power over the existence of the people that choose to be saved. This is what Pine Creek gets wrong in this conversation with you. I saw it. He thinks that the damned should have veto power over God's decision to create creatures that are freely going to accept him, that they don't even get to have existence because of the stubborn rebellion of the damned. That is not fair. It's just not fair at all. I have no idea where he gets that rule other than to emotionally inflate particular instances of evil rhetorically to make that point. This is a point David Hunt makes. This is in Philosophical Foundation. That is a fundamental moral axiom to me. Suppose that they are conscious. Just suppose they exist in this pre-existent state before God decides to instantiate. This just suppose, for the sake of argument, you got this crowd of people to his left and this crowd of people to his right. Crowd of people to his right are damned. They're saying, look, if you create us, You knowingly create us. We're going to be damned. Don't create the world or we're going to be damned. Stop. And then you got the crowd to the right saying, wait a minute. We don't even get to exist because you are going to be stubborn and do whatever it is you do to get damned. Look, I'm speaking callously right now, but that to me is not a very valid objection. No, I don't pretend to be able to persuade him. That's not my job. But what he says doesn't persuade me at all. That to me is a fundamental moral axiom. They should not have veto power over God's decision to, again, we have to put content into our concept of heaven. This is a huge deal. This is like take every pleasurable thing you've ever had in existence, put it to the infinite power, and put it in its right divine context in terms of union with God, with all that stuff. And we'll have to fill out the content, the concept of worship and all that's not going to be a church service. It's going to be something that's unspeakably amazing. And you're denying that to millions and millions of people because of their stubborn rebellion. I'm sorry, but I'm not a Calvinist, so I don't think God determines that. There's a really good quote that the damned don't have a choice about the world God actualizes, but they do have a choice about being saved in the world God actualizes. The two things are true at once. They don't have a choice about whether or not they're in a world in which they're damned. They don't have a choice about that, but they do have a choice about being saved in the world in which they find themselves. This is a quote attributed to a certain thinker in the Middle Ages, I forget, but it preserves their free will. Nothing's determining them to choose either one or the other. And just because they choose the way they choose, that does not mean that the saved don't get to be saved because of their stubbornness. That's a fundamental, just inside out way of looking at the fabric of the universe, in my opinion. I don't know. It's just, it doesn't ring true at all.
No, I agree. And
but I like,
and I want to explore more this idea of why couldn't God just create us all like Jesus, who would freely choose the good? Think about it for a minute, because I want to say something. Wait, think about it for a minute, because I want to say something about the side chat. Guys, there's been requests. There's a little bit of drama going on in the side chat. And I just want you guys to know that everybody is welcome here. And, on this channel, I am about grace and forgiveness for people. And so, this is not a cancel channel. Okay. I don't block people. I don't cancel them. There's one exception to that. I had to block somebody who was asking for money all the time. And so, but other than me? No, not you. It has nothing to do with you, MJ. No. They're arguing amongst themselves, but really all of you, are very welcome. I love you all. Kim is trying to start trouble as usual. I don't know if, Kim wanted to know, did Otangelo see my LGBTQ video? And, there is a lot of differences. Christians have different ideas about things. And there are some Christians who are not going to like me because of some of the things that I have said or that I will say. But, for me, that does not change my love for them or my, one desire to be unified. It's not a requirement that we all think alike in order to have love for each other. So that is, everybody is welcome here. So MJ, what is the deal? Why couldn't God just make us all like Jesus? So there wouldn't be rape and torture and would Jesus ever, could Jesus have let's go with this. Could Jesus have raped someone?
So hear me out.
Okay.
so people can be like, oh my God, he hesitated. So off with his head. There was no physical barrier between the bodily actions that are necessary for raping and, the actual state of affairs obtaining. Right. In terms of character, no. There's no possible in which Christ could rape anybody. Now, here's the thing. Just like Christ I have to use this concept to answer this question. I need to know you understand me before I keep going, because I don't like losing you.
Go for it. No, you're not going to lose me. I'm sticking with you. I'm going with you.
Good.
Go for it.
So let's just stay with you real quick.
Okay.
So you are probably like 25 years old, right?
I love
Okay,
you. I'm
sorry.
44.
I'd aim low. Okay. So
Good
every
job.
sin-
Good job.
Every single choice you made in your life, let's just say libertarian free will is the case. Every single choice you made freely. Okay. Let's just catalog that in a book. Here, let's see. Here it is. These are all the choices that Rebecca made in her life. I'm looking at them. Oh my goodness, what is wrong with you? Holy, oh,
Yeah.
you're so nice right there. Oh, cool. Okay, here they are.
Okay.
Now, every single one of these sentences in here that describe what you freely did are true. Their contraries are false. It's true that you freely decided to do X, and therefore it's false that you freely decided to do not X. We're on the same page so far, right?
Yep. I'm following you.
Okay.
Good.
This is your book. This is you.
Okay.
This is you. Now, God saw this prior to creation. He's like, oh my gosh, here's the book for Rebecca. Okay, she's going to be saved when she's such and such age. Okay, cool. I'm going to include this in my plan. I'm going to put this on this bookshelf here, and the whole bookshelf's a world, let's say. Okay. This entire book here, these are counterfactual propositions. Well, these are indicative one. You know what an indicative one is? That's just say it is the case. It is the case that you freely did this. Now, prior to him creating, these were counterfactual propositions, not indicative ones. So these are true or false, independent of God's will. Now, it is up to God whether or not he wants to instantiate this book. Instantiating this book can't happen without instantiating your essence. And your essence is everything that's true of you and can't be true of another essence. Okay, that's going to be this book right here. Now, here's Jesus's book. This is all the free will decisions that Jesus made when he was incarnated. Okay. Now, this is called counterfactuals of divine knowledge, not counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. I'm sorry, counterfactuals of divine freedom. Okay. Now, Molina said that these types of knowledge are both part of his mental knowledge. God has to know what he would do under any circumstances, and he has to know what Rebecca would do freely do under any set of circumstances. Now, let's say you lived at the same time Christ did. Okay. So these are going to intertwine here. Now, you still got two books, but let's say he healed you or something, right? Now, so there's going to be overlap right here where he healed you. And that little part of overlap could be considered like a sub part of both of your books or something like that. Mm-hmm. Now, why couldn't God create Rebecca like Jesus? Because when he goes to Rebecca's essence, he has to pull this book up off the shelf. This is going to be different from this book. This is what's entailed by Molina's model. It's not up to God what books are true of each essence. It's up to the essence what kind of books they're gonna have. The books are there, and I'm just saying it for the sake of analogy. Mm-hmm. These books exist, quote unquote. They don't exist. Nothing but God exists prior to creation. That's his aseity. But Molina postulated that the content of his mental knowledge is independent of his will, just like what Calvinists would say about God's knowledge of his necessary truths. He can't make a square circle. He can't make 2 + 2 = 5. So in the same way that those are outside of his control, the truth value of the counterfactuals are similarly outside of his control. So what a Molinist like myself would say to your question is, what reason do we have to think that God has it within his power to get, let me see, left is right, right is left here, to get another Rebecca book, which includes all these different things in here of her never sinning, of her never suffering, while it's interconnected with every other book, which is every other essence that God creates, when it's interrelated with every other essence in history and all the different essences she comes into contact with when she's alive, all that stuff's going to be in this book. How do we know that this book is actualizable? It's a book. It's possible. There's no explicit contradiction in the book. But when God goes to actualize, let's just feed it through actualization. When you feed it through, what happens is this book comes out. When you feed it through, the feeder of actualization. I'm trying to be really visual right now because a lot of this stuff's abstract. So therefore, even though God knows about this perfect Rebecca in his natural knowledge. This is a knowledge of all necessary
Like the
truths.
possibility.
All the possibilities. And with S5, modal logic, whatever is possible is necessarily possible. So even possible truth is had by God's natural knowledge. Even though he knows about this, he doesn't do this. This is anthropomorphic, what I'm doing right now. But the reason why we have no reason to think that if God were to go and feed this through the actualizer conveyor belt, that what happens is once Rebecca's actualized, all these propositions become true. Okay? That's what the Molinist is saying is epistemically possible. That just means for all we know, for all the things that we have epistemic access to, all our experience of this life, all experience of ourselves, all our experience of other creatures, all experience of God, we have no idea whether or not those particular essences are actualizable, even if possible. We have no idea. We're not privy to that kind of information. What we are privy to is the world in which we find ourselves. And the cool thing about the world in which we find ourselves, and David Lewis talks about this in Counterfactuals, is that we can talk about other possible worlds from this one. We have information about modality from our epistemic access to this world in which we find ourselves. And like I was saying before, because we know how you would freely act in this world, in the circumstances in which you find yourself, or how I would act, I freely decided to come on this show. So we know that prior to creation, that counterfactual is true. And so God could not actualize that past history of this world and all the circumstances that involve my life and have me freely not come on the show. He can't do that. Why? Because I freely came on the show. So we can use this world as an anchor point to make epistemic claims about other worlds and how similar they are to our world. So
now someone in the chat has said, can someone simplify his point? Okay, but so I will try to simplify his point.
This is Rebecca,
which is basically saying he's basically saying like God couldn't make it exactly as he wanted when we have freely choosing,
when you have libertarian free will,
right?
You can't make someone freely do something. That's the key point.
Okay, so but now this is kind of this might be getting us too far off topic, but I do think it's an interesting kind of caveat here to this, or tangent here. Okay, Dave says, is it up to God which place you are born and to what parents you were and grow up? Because this is interconnected with the free will, because okay, so if God is the creator of who we are, right? But then we've got our parents who made the decision to get together and have a child, right? So we're, if they're freely, what if those parents are freely choosing like different people, and a different essence is being actualized than the one that God intended? I mean, where's the intersection
from the first, this prior to your parents being born, prior to the first emergence of the strong force, strong nuclear force and gravity, before all of the singularity stuff, let's just say there's no multiverse. God's like, I'm going to create this world. So when he creates an entire world, all those details are already worked out. So let's just zoom in on his parents. Okay, so let's just pretend. Have you ever seen the beginning of Contact? That movie Contact with Jodie Foster?
It's been too many years. I wouldn't remember the
beginning.
Well,
yeah. At the very beginning, he's like zooming out really far in this world, and this galaxies and the universes. Let's zoom all the way into that guy's parents. Okay. Now, all that stuff had to happen in time, depending on your view of time, I guess. I'm going to leave that aside. But all that happened in time, and that happening in time was sovereignly brought about by God by virtue of the fact that he created a world in which that would happen at that time. So no matter what thing you point out, no matter what contingency in any world you happen to point out, all those contingencies are sovereignly accounted for by virtue of the fact that he created this world in which that would happen, as opposed to any other world. There's a certain virtue, there's a certain way the explanatory virtue of simplicity is cashed out in terms of elegance. that to me is really elegant. That's a beautiful thing about the theory. It accounts for contingencies and things that might or might not happen, could or couldn't happen, probably will or won't happen, would or wouldn't happen, all these different tenses. And it's all accounted for by the syntactically simple proposition that he made the world rather than another world. That's awesome.
Wait, you broke up a little bit in that last sentence. He made the world and he
made this world rather than another world. That would be, I think, a textbook example of syntactic simplicity. You can just take care of any contingency you want to talk about, any concern you have about your, well, I guess the question was about your free will. So here's the thing. So free will, I mean, Van Wagen famously said that under the issue of free will, his genius is rebuked. So while he is an incompatibilist, he thinks that free will and determinism are incompatible. He has no idea how to cash out libertarian views. They just seem arbitrary to him. He brings up this arbitrariness objection. But let me go to a restriction. So yes, your free will decisions are going to be the framework in which your free will decisions, the arena in which they're played out is going to be affected, like the frame of the picture is going to be affected by when your parents are born, where you're born, your geography, your psychological makeup, all that stuff. But what's called the soft libertarian will say, yes, that's true. But within that arena, within those borders over which you had no choice about, you didn't have a choice about that, in that little arena, there's contingency there. You have the choice to choose A or not A, B or not B. You have control over your choice. Now, you may or may not lose control upon subsequent decisions with character formation and what Robert King calls self-forming actions. These are times in your life where you're approached or you come into contact with some kind of crisis, like a moral kind of decision you got to make. You got to go to the left or you got to go to the right, and who you are is going to change forever depending on how you choose. And Robert King would say, like, okay, well, you have the principle of alternative possibilities there. You went freely to the left. But now that you did that, you kind of fixed your character a certain way, and you're kind of constricting your choices in one domain, but opening up possibilities in another domain. So it's almost like you're leaving a room in a big mansion and into a hallway with a bunch of different doors, but then the door behind you is slammed shut. So your options are being limited one way and opening up in another way. But as long as you have the power to choose A or not A in particular domains, then soft libertarianism would go through. And it's really interesting. You can apply that metaphor pretty elegantly to Christ's waking consciousness, right? His experience of free will with his decisions. Because once he made the decisions he made to form his character and how he formed it in time, even though there's different ways to cash out exactly what his consciousness might have been like. Like I've heard one view say that in order for him to truly experience temptation, he might have needed to be shielded from the knowledge that he could not fail the test. So it is the case that he couldn't fail, but he didn't know he couldn't fail. And so it was genuine temptation. Now that's a model. It's possible. That's a possible way to understand it. Who knows what was happening? We'll find out one day. Hopefully.
So are you saying it's not possible that Jesus could have raped someone?
Well, like I said, yes and no. It's impossible in the sense that his character cannot allow it. But it's possible in the sense that there's nothing coercing him to not do it. Like there's nothing in between him and the innocent woman that would prevent that thing from happening. In that sense, it's possible. Now, when people use the word possible, they're making it sound like, wow, he's the type of person that might. I'm not saying that at all. Jesus won't rape the girl. It's impossible for him to do it in the sense that there's no world in which he does it, and God's perfect and impeccable, and impeccability is impossible with sin. But it doesn't mean that there isn't an arena of choices that are available to Christ where he can choose A or not A. Now, the rape thing,
so now wait, stop there. What now? If that is true, that he had an array of choices, and then why couldn't God have just created everyone that way, where no one would ever choose rape, where we would all be in like Jesus, where we have an array of choices, but we wouldn't choose rape.
That is the point. That's where the rubber meets the road. All I do is rephrase what I've been saying the whole time. we have no good reason to think that that particular world is in that arena. It might be outside of the arena. Why? Because of these. If you feed it through the actualizer thing and it comes out as this rather than that, it's not going to be in the arena. But it's still in the arena in the sense that he had the decision to make the world or not. He could have said, no, I'm not going to make anything. That's what Pine Creek wants to do. He thinks that impugns God by making the world at all, right? So yeah, he freely made the world. He didn't have to make the world. I think there are other worlds he could have made, but we have to, I don't think we have access epistemically. Like, for all we know, we have access to this world, the world he chose to create, which sucks in some parts, but it's awesome in others, like what you said. This other world where everyone's saved and there's no tinkering at all with the causal interconnectivity of all the agents in the world. The number of people in the world doesn't go down or decrease. We're making all these changes, but we're holding this one thing fixed. And we're saying that is a realizable world. What's wrong with that? And I'm saying we have no reason to think that that's true, given the data that we have right now and the kind of modal access we would need to make judgments like that. It seems to me that what motivates that type of objection to me is this, and I'd be willing to explore this. I think people, what they do when they first thinking about modal speculation is they literally equate imaginability and possibility. They can imagine it. If they imagine it like a cartoon or a movie, it's possible. Now, I don't know of any philosopher that thinks that. I really don't. I think a lot of people use that mistaken identification as a lily pad to jump off into substantive modal speculation about what it is that's possible or not in terms of conceivability. But even that word conceivability sounds like imaginability. I'm conceiving it in my mind. I got a picture in my mind, but conceivability isn't necessarily imaginability. So I would say, yeah, we can imagine a world where everyone's saved. That's really easy to do. But then the natural theologian in this context is going to say, well, imaginability is not possibility. Yes, they overlap sometimes. We can imagine some things that are possible, but just because something is imaginable doesn't make it possible. There's other factors we've got to take into account. I lost you.
Okay.
Just kidding.
No. Well, I got momentarily.
Don't worry, once you get to be
distracted
my
by-
age, I'm sorry.
No, I got momentarily distracted by the chat, but I heard and understood most of what you said.
Yes.
But I guess it's still coming down for some people, like, well, why did God create the possibility at all of like why didn't he create us slightly different, like a slightly different essence?
Well, okay, this is a good question. So let me think about this. So I don't think that I'll say it like this. I can't understand exactly what that would amount to, because when I cash out the concept of making us slightly different, I'm thinking in my head, like, it seems to me that the endowment of the ability to have free will is a qualitative property. It's something that either you have or you don't, right? It's like being pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. It's not a degreed, I think they're called degreed properties. Degreed properties are properties you have a little bit of and a little, you don't have a little bit of, like I don't know, some made up property like obesity or something. I don't know. Maybe that's physically measured, but it seems to me that if you give an essence free will, this pops out automatically. It's okay.
Yeah.
That creature has free will. So therefore, once you instantiate that essence in a world, embed it in a world with other creatures and everything, this is going to fill up with propositions about what that creature would freely do in those circumstances. I mean, it's not a chronological kind of sequence. He doesn't have to wait for that to happen. God just knows this immediately. But it seems to me that if this just pops up just by virtue of you having libertarian free will, and I will say this, I don't think there's anything impossible about God actualizing a world where compatibilism is true. I really don't. And for inscrutable reasons, I don't know why. He thought I think he said, I want to give creature libertarian free will. I want to do this. Now, Calvinists will quibble with me about the scripture, the data of scripture and all this stuff, and I'll go back and forth with them. But I think that if my model is true, that God's like, no, I could have created that world where there is no suffering. Everyone does what they desire to do. This is what the compatibilists say. And I can make their character such that, they have the type of control necessary for moral responsibility, but they always choose the right thing. I could make that world, but, I didn't make that world. That's what I think happened.
Yeah.
I think he wants creatures with libertarian free will. I think that's going to be the type of free will necessary for robust character formation and soul making and all this stuff that you lose out on compatibilism. Now, compatibilists will hate what I just said, but I'm speaking in thesis sentences.
Now, Cameron says, Bread of Life, can you simplify his answer to your question? Why couldn't we be born with the same attributes as Jesus? So I am going to simplify it for you, Cameron. And this is something I think that is really beautiful that I'm looking at when I see your book example, MJ, when you're holding up this book and you're looking at all the things. Cameron, the reason he couldn't do it is because you wouldn't be you. And so God made the decision that you are worth existing, and you as you are. He actually liked you better as you are than if he had formed you in some kind of way where you had, always done according to his will, that he actually chose to let you. He thought the world would be better off for you to be free. And even if that included being able to cause suffering to other people at times, which we all do. And so I don't know. Do you think am I being fair in what you're saying, MJ, or do you want to say?
I agree with you. I was going to make a clarification too, because I think people might get the wrong idea. We're not saying that if we choose like Christ, we're going to have the attributes of Christ. I think that would be a necessary condition. We'd have to choose everything in accordance with the way Christ would freely choose. But there's a whole bunch of things that are going to be true of Christ that couldn't have been true for any creaturely essence. I mean, he's the second person in the Trinity. He's God, preacher. There's going to be types of books that are true about Christ because I think he could have made another world. I think he could have been incarnated in another world. I think that's totally possible, depending on his sovereign decision to create another world. I don't see a problem with that. So that would be another book. But the books that describe Christ are going to be completely different from the books that describe creaturely essences, just by virtue of the fact that I'm not God. And we're going to form our character completely differently than the way Christ formed his character, just by virtue of the fact that he's God. So, I think he's better.
Go ahead.
Oh, good. No, you go.
No, please.
You go. No, I'm just kidding. So I was just going to say, I think I forgot what I was going to say. Yeah, I think I got derailed. My bad. It'll come to me in a sec. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and he's made a big parachute for all of us, which is salvation through Jesus Christ.
Sufficient grace, right? Exactly.
So, no matter what ends up being written in that book, no matter what, choices you have made, the Lord has already provided for you to be restored, to be healed from all the choices you've made, from the suffering that you've caused other people to have. So he's provided a safety net for all of us. That's the word I was looking for. But yeah. So Matthew, Matthias says, I'm a bit late, but did you already answer the free will in heaven question? I mean, the difference, free will in heaven. Okay. So, So do you think there's free will in heaven?
Yes. So this is completely compatible with my soft libertarianism, right? So you live your whole life, right? You live your whole life. I'm speaking very briefly. I hope it doesn't come off as pert, but you live your whole life as a certain kind of person. You make certain kind of decisions. You undergo the sanctification process. That's a theological term for conforming yourself to the image of Christ, and implementing different spiritual disciplines. Sometimes people are called to that, to conform yourself to the image of Christ. And this is an important thing. And what happens throughout your life is you change with the assistance of the Holy Spirit into a certain kind of person. Now, what happens on the mechanics of it that happen after we die? I don't know. I have no idea how it happens. It seems to me that sanctification is synergistic in the sense that there's a give and take going on between the Spirit and me. But I think that once we're in union with God, once we go to heaven, I think our character will then be fixed. But it will be fixed in such a way that we will have a different arena. So we'll still have libertarian freedom. Just because we can't sin doesn't mean we don't have libertarian freedom. Those decisions are now off limits. But within the arena of non-sinful actions, there's a multitude, there's a plenitude. I don't know why we have to salvage libertarian free will at the cost of saying sinful actions are still possible. Sinful actions are going to be like Christ raping a girl. And it sounds awful to say that. I'll say something like eating roadkill. I've heard Piper use this word or this metaphor before. Yeah, it's possible for me to eat roadkill. It's possible. I would never, ever do that. So sin is going to look like that. Why would I sin when I have all this awesome stuff right now? We probably won't even entertain that kind of counterfactual. It would probably look so disgusting and small and ridiculous in the face of the holiness and the awesomeness of God and whatever that's going to look like. That's why I think theologians need to get on the ball about enriching our concept of heaven. That choice is going to be essentially impossible, even though there's going to be a sea of libertarian choices with regard to non-sinful actions. And that's all I want. I don't want the freedom to sin anymore.
Is it possible that the reason that we have to suffer so much here is so that we can be fully convinced how ugly the, sin really is? So that we can come to the point where, when we reach that state, we will recognize, we will have our own experience and knowledge of the difference between a place where God's will is always done and a place where God's will is not always done. And
I think it depends on your psychology, and God knows our psychology better than even we do. I think Lewis says the ins and outs of our individuality are a mystery to us, but one day they will no longer be a mystery to us. They're not a mystery to him. He knows exactly what he needs to do to us in terms of our sanctification process to sanctify not just like our spirits, but even the way our psychology drags us down in terms of like mental illnesses and anxieties and things like this. All this stuff is a type of bondage. But like I said, if we redescribe this bondage in terms of suffering that's entrusted to us, a cross that we're given to have an opportunity to grow beyond it, to for us to appropriate these quote unquote involuntary impositions on our will, right? I don't know if you've heard this before. To appropriate those things and to become one with it and to inculcate virtue in response to it and to rely on Christ as in the process of that inculcation. All of this stuff is what makes life worth living. And if all that stuff was out and we never experienced anything contrary to what we wanted, we'd be spoiled little brats. That would probably be a Black Mirror episode, to get whatever we wanted whenever we wanted, and nothing bad ever happened to us ever. There are certain goods that would be totally like inaccessible to us if all we experienced were pleasure and good and all this stuff. There's certain goods that are really amazingly weighty and rich, but that they're inaccessible to you if you haven't gone through a little bit of suffering first. Like there's people even in this life, they're like, you have no idea what I'm talking about unless you went through the same thing I did. Like, so war veterans can talk with each other and, an outsider will come in. You don't know what we're talking about, man. You weren't on the beach. I talked to people. I was in the Air Force. I went through boot camp about 12 years ago. It's receding into my memory. While it was happening, it felt like an eternity. It was like a concentration camp. It was awful. I hated it. I hated every second of it. Lack of privacy. You're always hungry. You're always sick. People yelling at you is awful. I'm glad I did it. Now, look, I'm only speaking for myself. But when I read autobiographies like by Corrie ten Boom, who was a Holocaust survivor, I'm not going to generalize from her experience to everybody that went through the Holocaust, which is what some people try to do. But when I listen to her, when she tells me, like, I'm not glad I went through it, but I wouldn't be the person I was if I hadn't experienced the heinousness of that disgusting evil that I had to witness. And I have to hear her testimony. And see, this gets out of the realm of analytic philosophy of religion into, look, this is the real life stuff This is the stuff that's actually a part of the fabric of the world that God chooses to sovereignly create, and we get out of the logic realm. When I listen to her, what am I supposed to say? Oh my gosh, you are treating the Holocaust lightly. You're being callous about it. I got to shut up and listen. This is why I like the Brothers Karamazov, because Christ in the Grand Inquisitor scene, he listens to Ivan go on and on and on and on and on about all the evils. And he just goes up and kisses him, because there really is nothing you could say against it. Unless there was a question he was asking on a logical level, you can meet him there. But when you're just talking about the heinousness of the evil, the kind of evil that Christ came into this world to face and experienced it himself, being who he is and having the consciousness he had, that kind of savior is what gets people through suffering. That's what gets through it. Post-world semantics, all that crap. People aren't going to think about this when they're going through an abusive relationship or things like that. This is the emotional problem of evil. This is the existential problem, and all I got to do is shut my mouth and listen to them. Now, when I listen to, like, let's say the response to that might be, well, here's another guy who came out of the Holocaust, and he's hardened against God, and he's not like Corrie ten Boom at all. What do I do then? I have to shut up. There's nothing to say. There really isn't, unless he asks me a logical question. Now he's shifting the domain from his experience to the logical realm, and I'll have that conversation. But I'm not even talking about Holocaust. I'm talking about, like, every day. The people in the chat, everybody's felt like lonely. Everybody's had their suffering like cheapened. Oh, everybody's lonely. Oh, get over it. Go. And then you're treated like crap by people. You get cheated. Your wife leaves you after 30 years. I mean, all this crap. I don't know what to say to that. That's awful. But I do know that there are lots and lots of people that went through that crap, come out the other end, and they go through a grieving process, and they'll talk to you about it at a bar with some song playing in the background. Who knows how God orchestrates the circumstances? And they tell you that, look, that was awful. What I went through, that was horrible. But I wouldn't have it any other way, and I can't explain why I would say that. Like, what do I do with that data point? That's a data point. But what sucks is these data points get cheapened because a lot of people don't like these points being made in apologetical context. They hate that. And I hate it too. It's like, oh, therefore you can't impute God's goodness. Like, can't even go there anymore. It's hard. You got to switch back and forth and put your human hat on and then your philosopher hat on. And it's just really hard, because I think the philosophy part of it, like, it's really important. Like, if you care about it as an actual obstacle. And I think that you have to existentially wrestle with these problems. But I think it just makes up like 1% of what life's all about, honestly, especially analytical problems. I mean, when we leave the computer and we go to our real lives, I'm not going to be thinking about this stuff for probably the rest of the day. I'm going to be going and playing with my son and fixing a flat tire and breaking my back, shoveling snow, and doing the real life stuff. So I think when we talk about the problem of evil kind of stuff, we got to keep that in the background and keep those as data points, if and only if those data points are lowering your credence level and the kind of probability or judgments you're making about certain properties God has. Just to kind of keep it in the background. I'm not saying don't be an expert Bayesian or anything. I'm not saying that. Just keep it in the background. Like, all that stuff, it matters, I think. But I don't know.
Well, it certainly matters. I mean, this is a question that comes up over and over again. And, I'm so glad you came on to kind of dive in a little deeper than I can do, because, I can only give people, the answers that, I don't have a philosophical answer. So yeah, I
think it all comes down. Have you ever seen Shawshank Redemption?
Yeah.
Yeah, the ending. It's just the ending. It's a kind of spiritual disposition I have. And at the end of the day, after all these arguments are talked about, and I'm on my deathbed with gray hair, and I'm there, and I think about everything I went through, all my regrets, everything. It's just, I really hope the Pacific is as blue as they say. I really hope. And then I'm going to close my eyes and something's going to happen. I don't know. I did the best I could, but we're all going to go there one day. And it's really weird to think about. I really hope I get to see this person or whatever concept of God that you have, I really hope that's why I hope it's the theological virtue, because it totally, it changes, it recalibrates the way you approach these questions. And I'm going to say it again, methodological. That's the key part. Like, how are you approaching the questions? What's your attitude in approaching them? Are you going to have a cynical attitude? If you can have a cynical attitude, all the answers are going to be colored cynically. If you're going to approach it satirically, if you're going to approach these questions, these deep questions from a comedic standpoint, it's never going to come through. This is why one of the Beatitudes is, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Because purity of heart, it's a mode of being. And if modes of knowing depend on modes of being, if your mode of being isn't going to change, isn't going to attitudinally kind of adjust to the appropriateness, isn't going to, like what Kierkegaard says, you have to attune yourself to certain problems. If you're not going to do that, if you're going to be combative, those solutions are going to look or appear or be perceived to be ludicrous. And I think it's meant to be like that. I think that's at the root of the hiddenness of God issue too. But I don't know. There's lots of issues.
Well, you know what? One of the
issues.
things that actually, I think we should probably close because it's been nearly 2 hours, but
oh, that's it?
I
That was a
just
half hour.
want to say what one of my favorite things that you said today was that, and I hope I quote it properly, but you said, we've been entrusted with the suffering that we experience.
Right.
And I think there is something really beautiful in that.
Right.
There are some horrible things that we can experience, and that as we experience those, we can know that. And of course, those who are watching who don't believe in God, I know this isn't going to help you, okay? But for those of us who do know God and still have to face the suffering that we may experience in this world, it gives me great comfort to know that, that is something that God has entrusted to me, that it's something that I can be, that he believed my essence could walk through. And so that is something precious. And so I don't feel like I have all the answers about suffering. I do think suffering should not be your dominant way of viewing the world, because there are many other aspects of reality that are a lot better indicators of who God is and his love for you. And so, that's what I wanted to say. And what about, and by the way, Sal has been complaining that we haven't cited any scripture. So I'm going to cite, I think it's Romans 8:28 that says, all things work together for the good for those who love the Lord and who are called according to his purpose. So I believe that not everything is good. There are evil things that happen. Like you said, MJ, there are evil things that happen, but all even those evil things that happen can be worked together to make something beautiful. And, I think of God as a mosaic artist. He's taking the broken things, he's taking the broken pieces that we make, and he is making it into something beautiful. MJ, what do you have any final words that you want to say?
I apologize about the scriptures. I like the beginning of James. Just when we start talking about this stuff philosophically, please know that everything the scripture says is paramount to me. Of course, I'm not demeaning that at all. So that's my bad.
You don't need to apologize. Like you said, we're having this was meant to be more of a philosophical discussion, because I can't bring that. And so
all that to say, scripture is part of my background knowledge, by the way. So every time I said background knowledge, scripture's in there. Cool. I said it like a zillion times. The only thing that lingers, and it will always linger for every generation, for every human being, with everything we said, is the heinousness of particular instances of evil. That's the only thing. Because we can talk about the metaphors of Mosaic, and it's great. That's a great metaphor. The dark parts of the Mosaic are or what? And then we zoom in on it and we see some little girl being raped. It's like, you know what I mean? So I see why this problem will be perennial. It will never go away.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff, dealing with that, like every individual has to come to terms with what that is, why that would be permitted, what the girl is going to be like when she grows up and finally dies, or what she's going to say about the abuse. Is she going to harden? Could God have done things differently to make her not harden? I don't know. It's the thing. I have no idea. But he permitted it. So he didn't do it. That helps me a little bit. But he did make the world in which it happened. But then let's say she was saved. But let's see then if she wasn't saved and she went through all that for nothing. See, this is why this is thorny. And I don't want to make the atheists or the skeptics and stuff in the chat. No, I'm not unaware of that. It's hard. This is a hard problem.
Yeah.
We can talk about the logical aspect, but I don't think a lot of people really care. I think the philosophers care about the logical problem of evil. I think they care about it. But the vast majority of people are looking at what's happening over in the Ukraine right now, the suffering in the world, and the greatest hits of suffering throughout history, and the macabre ways that humans can treat each other. And we just think about the fact that, why couldn't God just do to these people what we read of him doing in the scriptures? Like he came down like a fire with Job and the pillar of fire with Moses. And why can't he? But that's the thing. This is the thing. This is where I get tripped up on. Because God knew what would happen if he did it, when he does do it, when he did it as recorded in scripture. I'm not denying that. But now we're speculating. Mm-hmm. Like, what if he did come in that room and, I don't know, tied that guy, her father, down and let that little girl free? That's great. That's beautiful. It's a good thing that God could have done. But then left her go. And had that not happened, other things wouldn't have happened. But let's say she leaves the basement. We have to go. This is why the problem of evil is so thorny. We have to let her now live her life with that particular event that happened. And this event it's intertwined with who she is now. And it's going to enter into the motivational structure of her psychology and all the different things that go into what kinds of decisions she makes. And all of that is going to lead to what? Her eventually rejecting Christ? Okay, but then what? Why'd you create her then? Okay, let's erase her from existence. The guy never had her as a daughter. Okay, now look, we have a different ripple effect now. Say because of that thing that happened. So this is the main intuition pump behind Pine Creek's worry. Why create them? Why, if we're going to have all these different morally abhorrent ripple effects, why do this? But then it gets back to my issue. You have the innocent suffering, the girl, but why should no one be alive because of this evil idiot father? So it comes down to that. Why should everyone be denied? So now I'm like, okay, are there goods that are going to come out of this? You hope to God there is, and the goodness of God is promises. Yes, there is going to be something good. Well, okay, what is it? What could possibly outweigh that girl being violated? I can't think of anything. So then I go to the end of Shawshank Redemption. I know who God is. I've seen him work in the past. I've seen him work in my own life. I have no idea. I can't do anything with this girl other than to listen to her and hug her and kiss her. Okay. Everything I'm going to say is going to sound stupid to her. And I just hope that there's something on the other side where that girl is like, okay, I see why that happened now. Yeah. It's the only thing that we got at the end of the day. The eloquence of philosophy, all this, everybody's going to walk away from these weird philosophical conversations, and they're going to have to come face to face with that. There's got to be something that God does, something that I have no idea what it is. It's on the other side where this girl is going to see why this was allowed to happen to her. Mm-hmm. And that's all I got. That's really all I don't have any. I'm still young. I'll think about this more, but that's really, I think, all we got. If I went up to Plantinga, I said, "Hey, Plantinga, this is about all we got, right?" I'm pretty sure he'd probably agree with me. I mean, he's talking about something Mackie brought up, but I'm saying this is all. This is it. The hope that we have that there's something that compensates for this crap that happens in this world. That's going to happen in the next world. And let's say this girl died when she's 78. It's only 78 years. It's it. It's just 78 years. And you know, immortality is a long time.
Yeah.
I don't know how time works in the afterlife,
Yep.
but I have confidence. I have faith, which is a passion, as Kierkegaard talks it. It's something that we really need to subjectively appropriate. And it's a cross, and it hurts sometimes. But I have faith that she'll see something that we couldn't explain in the afterlife, some kind of mode of revelation that Christ is going to give this girl that went through this crap, that she sees why she had to go through that. I don't know. That's all I got.
Yes.
And if that's going to keep you from coming to Christ, which is the key point, because that's what I care about, I will talk to you about it until I fall asleep. I don't know what else to do. And I'll pray for you, because I think I have more confidence that your skepticism is wrong, and that something's going to happen in the afterlife from this omnipotent, all good, amazing God. Something's going to happen where she's going to see. I have more confidence in that than I would in the skepticism. And we just got to explore it. That's why I said it's diachronic. A lot of these things people appropriate over time. It's not a split-second speed chess move. Oh, God has morally sufficient reasons. I'm not going to pretend that's going to work. Yeah, I think that's true. But people need to mull that over, meditate on it, and contemplate it. And I don't know. I'm not shutting up. Sorry.
Well, and I like what Janet says here. She puts this verse up here. He that comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. And I believe that. You know, I know God, and I know his love. I know that he is faithful, and I believe that he has the ability and the plan to make all of our suffering worth it.
It's going to be something else.
Yeah.
The way it's going to be, you know, you don't speculate, but the way it's going to be revealed to us is going to involve something so overwhelmingly, amazingly, like something along the lines. I've always thought of it something along the lines of the Christmas Carol, something where you're able to go revisit these times with Christ by your side, and he's giving you a vision. It's going to be something that's going to satisfy us. It's going to satisfy us. I have no idea what it is, but it's going to satisfy us. And
you know, and earlier in the stream, earlier Jamie Russell put up a verse about that, you know, that we've been called to suffer for Christ's sake. And I don't think that any of our suffering is going to be forgotten by God. I think he treasures up the suffering that we've done for him. Guys, it looks like Jamie is going to continue and go to his channel after this discussion. And so I'm putting the link to his channel in my in the chat here. So I think we will go ahead and close it out. You guys can go to Jamie Russell's channel to continue talking about the problem of evil. Thank you so much, MJ. God bless you, and we'll talk again.
Peace, love.
And go to please subscribe to Democracy of the Dead. That's MJ's channel.
Really slow right now.
That's okay.
I just got StreamYard, by the way. I was just like, I can't do this OBS stuff. I'm not computer literate, so I might do more live streams coming up. We'll see.
Awesome.
We'll see.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you.